Story 1, Beneath the Floorboards. The old Callaway house had always been the subject of rumors. A sprawling Victorian mansion on the edge of town, it had stood abandoned for decades, its once bright facade now weathered and decayed. Some said it was haunted, while others believed darker things had happened there. None of this deterred Adam and Rachel, a young couple eager to escape the chaos of the city. The house was a bargain, and they couldn't pass it up. The first few weeks passed uneventfully. They busied themselves with repairs, cleaning out years of dust and grime. But from the start, Rachel had felt uneasy. There was something about the house, the way it creaked at night, the drafts that came from nowhere, the way the air in the living room always seemed just a bit colder than the rest of the house. Adam dismissed her concerns as new house jitters. "It's old," he'd say with a shrug. Houses like this make noise, but the noises weren't normal. Late at night, Rachel began to hear faint sounds, scratching, almost like fingernails dragging across wood. It seemed to come from below, somewhere deep beneath the floorboards. One evening, as the wind howled outside, Rachel was alone in the living room, curled up with a book. The fire crackled in the hearth, its warm glow the only light in the room. That's when she heard it again, a faint, persistent scratching. "Adam," she called, her voice trembling. He appeared in the doorway moments later, wiping his hands on a rag. "What is it?" That sound. "Listen." They stood in silence. At first there was nothing, but then it came again. Soft, deliberate scratching, like something trying to claw its way out. Adam frowned. "Probably rats. It's an old house, remember?" "That's not rats," Rachel whispered, her face pale. "It's coming from right beneath us." Reluctantly, Adam fetched a flashlight and a crowbar. Pulling back the rug in the living room, he revealed a trap door embedded in the floorboards. Rachel stared at it, her unease growing. "I didn't know this was here," Adam said, his brow furrowed. Neither of them had seen it during their initial inspection of the house. The trapdoor was old, its edges worn, the metal ring tarnished with rust. With some effort, Adam pried it open. A rush of stale, cold air wafted up, carrying the faint smell of damp earth and decay. The flashlight beam revealed a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. "I'm not going down there," Rachel said, her voice shaking. Adam, ever the skeptic, shrugged. "I'll take a quick look. Probably just an old storage cellar." He descended slowly, the light bouncing off the damp stone walls. The space below was small, more of a crawl space than a cellar, but as he moved the beam across the ground, his stomach dropped. Bones. Scattered across the dirt floor were human bones, broken and yellowed with age, and in the corner, something moved. "Rachel?" Adam called, his voice shaking. "You need to see this." Reluctantly, she joined him, gasping when the light revealed the gruesome scene. "What is this?" she whispered, covering her mouth. The scratching sound began again, louder now, coming from the far wall. Adam turned the flashlight toward it, revealing claw marks etched deep into the stone. "It's like someone was trying to get out," Rachel said, her voice barely audible. The air grew colder, and the scratching turned into a low, guttural growl. Suddenly, the flashlight flickered and died, plunging them into darkness. "Adam!" Rachel screamed, grabbing his arm. The growl grew louder, and the sound of something moving, something large, echoed through the small space. Panic set in, and they scrambled back up the stairs, slamming the trapdoor shut behind them. That night, neither of them slept. The scratching continued, growing louder, more frantic, as if whatever was beneath the floorboards was desperate to escape. The next morning, they decided to leave the house, but as they packed their belongings, the trapdoor burst open with a deafening crash. A figure emerged, a gaunt, twisted thing with hollow eyes and jagged teeth. Its limbs were unnaturally long, its body covered in patches of decayed flesh. "You let me out," it hissed, its voice like dry leaves scraping together. Adam and Rachel tried to run, but the creature was fast. It dragged them back to the living room, its clawed hands impossibly strong. Their screams echoed through the house, but no one was there to hear them. When the neighbors finally noticed the couple's absence weeks later, the house stood silent once more. The only sign of them was the rug in the living room, now slightly askew, hiding the trapdoor beneath. And at night, if you stood outside the Calloway house and listened closely, you could hear it. The faint, relentless scratching beneath the floorboards. Story 2, The Whispering Shadows. In the small, isolated town of Ravenswood, nestled at the edge of the ancient blackthorn forest, the air was thick with superstition. The townsfolk spoke in hushed tones about the forest, warning everyone to never enter it after sunset. At the heart of the fear was the legend of the Whispering Shadows, an unseen force that was said to haunt the woods, luring in the unwary with voices of the lost. Leela, a headstrong young woman, had never believed in such tales. Stories about haunted forests and malevolent shadows were the sort of thing her grandmother loved to tell to keep children in line. But when her younger brother Sam disappeared one chilly autumn evening, the whispers began to feel real. Sam had been playing near the woods when their dog Max bolted into the trees. Without hesitation, Sam had followed. By the time anyone noticed he was gone, night had fallen. A search party scoured the forest's edge, but no one dared go deeper once the sun set. All they found was Max, whining and shaking, his fur matted with twigs and dirt. Lila couldn't accept it. The town might have given up, but she wouldn't. Sam was her little brother, and she was determined to bring him home. The next evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Layla stood at the forest's edge. Armed with a flashlight, a map, and sheer determination, she stepped into the darkness. The air grew colder as she ventured deeper, the towering trees blotting out the moonlight. Shadows stretched long and strange, moving as though alive. At first, the forest was eerily silent, save for the crunch of leaves beneath her boots. Then, faintly, she began to hear it. A soft murmuring, like distant whispers carried on the wind. She froze, straining to listen. The voices were indistinct, but she could make out her name. Lila? Lila? Her stomach twisted. It had to be her imagination, or maybe the wind. But the whispers grew louder, more insistent, surrounding her from every direction. "Sam!" she called out, her voice trembling. The whispers paused. Then she heard it. A laugh. It was Sam's laugh, clear and bright. Relief and fear warred within her. She turned in the direction of the sound, her flashlight beam slicing through the dark. "Sam, I'm here. Where are you?" No answer came, only the continued whispers, mingling with faint laughter. She pressed on, the beam of her flashlight revealing more of the twisted, gnarled trees. The deeper she went, the stranger the forest became. The trees seemed to close in, their branches like skeletal fingers clawing at her. The whispers grew louder, overlapping like a crowd speaking in tongues. Among them, she could still hear Sam's voice, pleading, "Help me, Leela. Please." Her heart pounded. She broke into a run, her flashlight bouncing wildly. The path twisted and turned, leading her to a small clearing bathed in faint moonlight. The flag, there, standing in the center, was Sam. "Sam!" she cried, rushing toward him. But as she drew closer, she stopped cold. Something was wrong. His back was to her, his frame too still, too rigid. "Sam?" she whispered. Slowly he turned. Leela gasped, stumbling back. His eyes were hollow voids, his skin pale and stretched tight over his bones. His mouth opened, but the voice that came out wasn't his own. The suppression of the pain was clear, but to her, it sounded like a shriek, or the sound, "You shouldn't have come," it said, echoing like many voices speaking at once. Before she could move, the shadows surged around her, rising like a living tide. They formed grotesque shapes, elongated limbs, faceless heads, glowing eyes that pierced the darkness. The whispers became deafening, a cacophony of torment. "Stay," they hissed. "Join us." Eli tried to scream, but the sound was swallowed by the shadows. They enveloped her, cold and suffocating, pulling her into their endless void. The last thing she saw was Sam, his hand reaching for her, his expression one of sorrow and regret. The next morning, the townsfolk found Lila's flashlight lying at the forest's edge. Its beam flickered weakly, pointing toward the trees. There was no sign of her or Sam. The search was brief. No one dared venture deeper. As days turned to weeks, the whispers began to spread beyond the forest. On quiet nights, if you stood at the edge of Blackthorn Forest and listened closely, you could hear them, the voices of Lila and Sam mingling with countless others, trapped in an endless, mournful echo. The townsfolk added another rule to their superstitions. Never call out to the whisperers, for the shadows are always listening, and once they hear your voice, they'll never let you go. Ravenswood remained quiet, but the legend of the whispering shadows endured, a grim reminder of those who had been lost, and those who might yet be claimed. Exercise. Story 3. The Curse of Black Hollow. Black Hollow was the kind of place that made people uneasy. The dense forest loomed at the edge of Greywood like a living thing, its gnarled branches clawing at the sky. The villagers avoided it at all costs, their warnings passed down through generations. Never go into Black Hollow after dark. It wasn't just a rule, it was a survival instinct. The story behind the forest's curse was etched into Greywood's collective memory. Centuries ago, a woman named Ilara was accused of witchcraft and dragged into the heart of the forest. There, beneath a blood moon, the villagers burned her alive, her screams echoing through the trees. Before the flames consumed her, Ilara uttered a curse, damning the land and its people. "You who took my life will know no peace. The hollow will consume you." Over the years, the legend grew. Those who ventured into the forest after nightfall never returned, and their voices were said to join the whispers carried on the wind. Emma had heard the stories all her life. She'd grown up in Greywood, rolling her eyes at the villagers' superstitions. Now, 24 and back in town after college, she felt even more disconnected from the lore. To her, Black Hollow was just a creepy forest with a spooky backstory. So, when her boyfriend Jake suggested they camp there for Halloween with their friends, she laughed at the idea. "Seriously, you want to scare the life out of everyone with ghost stories in the woods?" she teased. Jake grinned. "Exactly. Come on, Emma, it'll be fun. Plus, think of the Instagram pics." Despite her initial hesitation, Emma agreed. That's how she, Jake, and their 3 friends, Mia, Tyler, and Sophie, found themselves trekking into Black Hollow as the sun dipped below the horizon. The forest was unnervingly quiet. The group's laughter and chatter felt out of place, like a violation of some unspoken rule. Emma couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, though every time she glanced over her shoulder, there was nothing but trees and shadows. They found a clearing near the center of the forest and set up camp. Jake insisted on lighting a fire, despite Emma's uneasy protests. "Relax," he said, striking a match. "It's just a campfire. We'll be fine." As the flames crackled and danced, the group tried to lighten the mood. They shared ghost stories, toasted marshmallows, and took turns daring each other to venture into the surrounding woods. But beneath the laughter, the forest seemed to press in closer, the trees casting long, distorted shadows. It started with the whispers. At first, they were faint and barely audible over the crackling fire. But as the night deepened, the whispers grew louder, more distinct. They seemed to come from all around, voices speaking in a language none of them could understand. "Did you hear that?" Mia asked, her voice trembling. Jake waved it off. "Probably the wind." Emma wasn't so sure. The whispers carried an eerie, unnatural cadence, like they were alive. She looked around, shining her flashlight into the dark. The beam illuminated nothing but trees and mist. Then came the footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and impossibly heavy. "Who's there?" Jake called, standing and turning toward the sound. No response. The fire flickered, dimming as if something were sucking the light from it. The whispers stopped, replaced by a bone-chilling silence. And then, out of the darkness, a figure emerged. At first, It looked human. A woman draped in tattered black robes, her hair wild and matted. But as she stepped into the firelight, her true form became clear. Her face was scarred and burned, her hollow eyes glowing faintly red. Her mouth curled into a grotesque smile, revealing teeth sharp as needles. Out of nowhere the thing came. A spear like the one the chieftain had been carrying fell from the hands of Halloran. "You've broken the pact," the figure hissed, her voice a mix of rage and sorrow. The group froze, too terrified to speak. "Leave now," Sophie shouted, her voice cracking. The woman's laugh was cold and hollow. "You dare command me in my domain?" She raised a skeletal hand, and the fire snuffed out, plunging them into darkness. Panic erupted. Emma felt Jake grab her arm, and they ran blindly through the forest, their flashlights swinging wildly. The whispers returned, louder and more urgent, surrounding them like a swarm. "They're coming!" Tyler screamed, but his voice was cut off abruptly. Emma turned, but Tyler was gone, vanished into the shadows. A blood-curdling scream echoed through the forest, followed by silence. "We have to keep moving," Jake yelled, dragging Emma forward. They stumbled into another clearing, gasping for breath. The air was thick and heavy, the mist swirling unnaturally around them. Mia and Sophie were gone. Only Emma and Jake remained. "What's happening?" Emma whispered, tears streaming down her face. Jake shook his head, his eyes wide with terror. "I don't know, but we have to get out of here." Before they could move, the ground beneath them began to tremble. Roots burst from the earth, twisting and coiling like snakes. They wrapped around Jake's legs, dragging him to the ground. "Emma, help me!" he screamed, clawing at the dirt. She lunged forward, grabbing his hands, but the roots were too strong. They pulled him into the earth, his screams fading as the ground sealed shut. Emma stumbled back, her mind reeling. She was alone now, the whispers louder than ever. "You cannot escape," the voice of the woman echoed through the forest. Emma turned, and there she was, the cursed figure, standing impossibly close. Her glowing eyes bore into Emma's soul. "Why are you doing this?" Emma cried. The woman's smile widened. "This is my vengeance. All who trespass here pay the price. Your suffering will feed the hollow." The last thing Emma saw was the figure reaching for her, skeletal fingers closing around her throat. The next morning, the villagers of Greywood found no trace of Emma, Jake, or their friends. All that remained was the smoldering remains of their campfire and 5 faint sets of footprints leading into the forest. The whispers in Black Hollow grew louder after that night, as if the forest had gained new voices to add to its chorus, and the villagers, already wary of the cursed woods, made sure their warnings were even clearer. Never go into Black Hollow after dark. Story 4. The Last Breath of the Forgotten. The town of Evershade was dying. Once a bustling mining settlement, it had withered to a near ghost town when the mines ran dry. Only a few stubborn souls remained, clinging to their homes like barnacles to a sinking ship. Among them was Marin, a solitary artist who had moved there for the quiet. She'd been drawn to the eerie beauty of the abandoned town, finding inspiration in its crumbling facades and overgrown streets. But Evershade had secrets, and Marin was about to unearth them. It began with the old house at the edge of town, a towering relic of the past. The locals called it the Forgotten. No one knew its true name or its origins. Stories of its last inhabitants, a reclusive family who vanished overnight, had faded into legend. Most of the villagers avoided the place, claiming it was cursed. Marin dismissed their warnings as small-town superstition. To her, the Forgotten was simply another piece of decaying history. She sketched it often, captivated by its gnarled architecture and broken windows that seemed to stare like hollow eyes. One gray afternoon, as a storm brewed on the horizon, Marin decided to explore the house. She crossed the overgrown garden, pushing open the wrought iron gate that groaned like a wounded animal. The front door was ajar, as if inviting her in. Unlike before, when she turned the handle, the door was not open but eerily slided sideways in the hull. The air inside was thick with dust and the faint scent of mildew. Mirren's boots echoed against the warped wooden floorboards as she stepped into the grand foyer. A shattered chandelier hung precariously from the ceiling, its crystals dulled by time. She wandered through the rooms, her sketchbook in hand, marveling at the forgotten grandeur. A piano, its keys yellowed and cracked, stood in the parlor. Faded portraits of grim-faced strangers lined the walls. Then she found the journal. It lay on a table in what might have once been a library, its leather cover brittle and flaking. Mirren opened it carefully, the pages filled with spidery handwriting. It belonged to someone named Eliza, the last known resident of the house. The entries began innocuously. "The storms are relentless this season. Mother says they're an omen. I think she's just frightened of shadows." But as Mirren read further, the tone shifted. The journal spoke of voices whispering at night, footsteps echoing in empty halls, and a suffocating presence that seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. "Mother says the house breathes. She's not wrong. I can feel it, the way the air presses against my skin, the way it grows heavier, as if alive. She says it will take us one by one." The last entry was barely legible, written in a frantic scrawl. "It knows. It watches. The breath is everywhere. We are already gone." A chill ran down Mirren's spine. She closed the journal and set it down, her hands trembling. That's when she heard it, a soft, labored wheeze, like the inhale and exhale of a dying creature. It filled the room, coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. "Hello?" Mirren called, her voice trembling. The wheezing grew louder, followed by faint whispers. She couldn't make out the words, but they carried a desperate, pleading tone. The air grew heavier, oppressive, as if the house itself were drawing in breath. "Stars." She turned to leave, but the door slammed shut with a deafening crash. The whispers turned into a cacophony, overlapping voices crying out in anguish. Mirren ran, her heart pounding. She bolted up the grand staircase, searching for another way out. The air felt alive, pushing against her, slowing her down. She burst into a bedroom at the end of the hall and slammed the door behind her. The room was untouched by time. A four-poster bed stood in the center, its linens pristine. On the bedside table was a single candle, its flame burning without flickering despite the lack of wind. And then she saw the figure. A woman stood by the window, her back to Mirren. Her hair was long and dark, cascading over a tattered dress. "Eliza," Mirren whispered, though she didn't know why. The woman turned, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes hollow and unseeing. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. Only that same wheezing breath. "Leave," the figure rasped, her voice like dry leaves. "Before it takes you too." The walls began to tremble, and the whispers turned into screams. The air grew colder, and the candle flickered violently before snuffing out. Mirren didn't wait. She flung open the door and raced down the stairs, the house groaning and shuddering around her. The front door was open now, and she ran through it without looking back. Outside, the storm had broken, rain lashing down in sheets. She didn't stop running until she reached her home at the other end of town. For days, Mirren stayed inside, haunted by what she had seen and heard. She tried to forget, to convince herself it was her imagination, but every night, as she lay in bed, she could hear it. The soft, labored breathing, growing louder. One morning, she woke to find her sketchbook on the floor. It was open to a drawing of the forgotten, but something was wrong. The windows of the house were no longer empty. Shadowy figures stared back at her, their hollow eyes fixed on her own, and the whispers began again. Mirren realized the truth too late. The forgotten wasn't just a house. It was alive. It had taken Eliza and her family, and now it wanted her. The curse of the forgotten was eternal, a trap that consumed anyone who dared disturb it. Her last breath was taken in silence as the whispers swallowed her whole, and the forgotten waited patiently for its next victim. Story 5. Haunting of Hillcrest Manor. Hillcrest Manor loomed atop a hill like a forgotten relic of a dark past. Its once glorious Victorian architecture was now cloaked in ivy, its windows cracked like the eyes of a corpse staring out at the small town below. Locals avoided the estate, crossing the street to avoid its shadow. The stories were too numerous, too unsettling. Strange lights in the windows, streams heard on windless nights, and those who entered the house but never came out. For Olivia Whitaker, an aspiring journalist, Hillcrest Manor was the perfect story. She had returned to her hometown of Crestwood after college, restless and eager to prove herself. The manor's dark history was her ticket to recognition. Armed with a notebook, a flashlight, and her recording equipment, Olivia set out to spend a night in the infamous Hillcrest Manor, determined to uncover its secrets. The evening was thick with mist as Olivia approached the manor. The iron gates creaked open with a mournful groan as if warning her to turn back. She hesitated for only a moment before stepping inside. The path to the front door was overgrown, the weeds clawing at her boots like skeletal fingers. The front door resisted her push, groaning as it opened into the grand foyer. The air inside was stale, heavy with the scent of rot and mildew. Dust motes swirled in the beam of her flashlight as she took in the decaying splendor. A grand staircase spiraling upward, walls lined with faded portraits, and furniture draped in tattered sheets. She set her equipment on a dusty table, her camera pointed at the staircase. "This is Olivia Whitaker," she began, her voice echoing in the cavernous space. "I'm inside Hillcrest Manor, a place said to be haunted by the restless spirits of its tragic past." The house responded with silence, but the atmosphere seemed to shift, growing heavier. Olivia wandered the halls, her flashlight revealing fragments of a bygone era. A music room with a piano whose keys were yellowed with age. A library filled with books whose spines crumbled at her touch. The whispers of the house's history seemed to surround her, faint and elusive. The whispers turned real as she entered the dining room. At first they were faint, like the rustling of leaves, but they grew louder, forming words she couldn't understand. Olivia froze, her heart pounding. "Hello?" she called, her voice trembling. The whispers stopped. Then, the chandelier above her rattled violently, dust raining down. She bolted from the room, her breath ragged. She found herself in the master bedroom. The air here was colder, and the sense of unease was palpable. The bed was still made, the linens eerily untouched. On the dresser, a cracked mirror reflected her pale, wide-eyed face. The room felt wrong, as though someone or something was watching her. She turned to leave, but the door slammed shut on its own. The temperature dropped sharply, her breath visible in the beam of her flashlight. The whispers returned, louder now, filled with malice. "Get out!" a voice rasped, deep and guttural. Her flashlight flickered and died. In the darkness, she fumbled for her phone, its weak light barely illuminating the room. That's when she saw them, shadowy figures emerging from the walls, their forms twisted and unnatural. Olivia screamed, backing into a corner. The figures moved closer, their hollow eyes fixed on her. She could feel their anger, their pain, as if the house itself was alive and feeding on her fear. Desperate, she reached for her camera, its red recording light still blinking. "What do you want?" she cried, her voice cracking. The shadows stopped, and for a moment the room was silent. Then a single figure stepped forward, more defined than the others. It was a woman, her face gaunt and pale, her eyes filled with sorrow. "Help us," the woman whispered, her voice a fragile plea. Olivia's fear was replaced by confusion. "How?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Before the woman could answer, the shadows surged forward, their forms dissolving into a swirling darkness that engulfed Olivia. She felt as though she were drowning, her lungs burning, her screams muffled by the void. When Olivia woke, she was lying on the front lawn of Hillcrest Manor. Her equipment was gone, her flashlight shattered beside her. She stumbled to her feet, disoriented and trembling. The house loomed silently behind her, its windows dark. She fled down the hill, not stopping until she reached the safety of her apartment. Days later, Olivia reviewed the footage from her camera, which had mysteriously reappeared on her doorstep. The video was distorted, filled with static and strange noises. But among the chaos, she caught glimpses of the shadowy figures, their forms writhing in the darkness. And then, a voice. Soft, pleading. Free us. Determined to uncover the truth, Olivia delved into the history of Hillcrest Manor. She discovered that the original owner, a wealthy industrialist named Victor Harrington, had been a cruel and abusive man. Many servants had died under his roof, their deaths covered up to protect his reputation. Rumors of black magic and occult rituals had swirled around him until his mysterious disappearance in 1897. Olivia returned to the manor one final time, armed with knowledge and resolve. She found the hidden room beneath the house where Victor had conducted his rituals. The walls were covered in strange symbols, and in the center of the room was a circle of blackened stone. She recited the banishment spell she had found in her research, her voice steady despite the growing sense of dread. The house groaned as if in pain, the shadows writhing violently around her. With a final deafening scream, the shadows dissolved and the air grew still. Hillcrest Manor still stands, but the whispers are gone. Olivia's story brought her fame, but she rarely speaks of what truly happened that night. She knows the spirits are at rest, but she also knows something darker lurked in the house, something that still watches, waiting for its chance to return. Hillcrest Manor remains, a silent witness to the horrors it once held, and a warning to those who dare to disturb its long-forgotten secrets. Story 6. The Witch's Cry. The town of Blackthorn had always been shrouded in shadow, both literal and figurative. Tucked deep within the hollow of the dark spire forest, the town was perpetually overcast, with the sun rarely piercing the thick canopy of trees. The villagers whispered of a curse, a chilling legacy tied to the legend of Lilith Graves, the Witch of Blackthorn. 3 centuries earlier, Lilith was accused of sorcery when children vanished from the village, their tiny shoes found scattered near the forest's edge. Dragged from her secluded cottage, she was bound and burned at the stake in the town square. As the flames consumed her, she screamed a curse. "You who condemn me will hear my cry forever. Your bloodlines will wither, your nights will never be silent, and I will not rest until justice is mine." Since that day, the town was haunted by what the villagers called the Witch's Cry. A mournful wail would rise from the forest on windless nights, echoing through the town like a banshee's lament. People spoke of shadows that moved on their own, of whispers that came from nowhere, and of children who would vanish without a trace every generation. For Evie Marlowe, Blackthorn was a prison she could not escape. At 25, she had spent her entire life in the gloomy village, tending to her ailing grandmother and working at the local inn. Her parents had vanished when she was a child, yet another mystery the villagers attributed to Lilith's curse. But Evie wasn't one to believe in curses or witches. She was practical, skeptical, and weary of the town's paranoia. That all changed the night she heard the cry. It was just past midnight when it started. A low, keening wail that rose and fell, carrying an otherworldly sorrow. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, seeping through the walls of her small cottage and wrapping around her like a cold embrace. Evie bolted upright in bed, her heart pounding. She stumbled to the window, peering out into the foggy night. The sound grew louder, and then she saw it. A flicker of movement at the edge of the forest. A shadow, too large to be an animal, lingering just beyond the tree line. She thought of the stories, of the warnings to never enter Darkspire Forest after dark. But something compelled her, a pull she couldn't explain. Grabbing her lantern and cloak, she stepped into the night. The forest was alive with sounds. Branches creaked, leaves rustled, and the faint cry seemed to weave through the trees, leading her deeper. The path grew darker as the canopy thickened, and soon her lantern was the only source of light. Then she found it, in clearing bathed in a pale, ghostly glow. In the center stood a stone circle, weathered with age and covered in moss. Symbols were etched into the stones, their meanings lost to time. But what truly made her blood run cold was the figure kneeling in the circle. It was a woman, her form flickering like a flame, translucent yet vivid. Her hair was long and wild, her eyes hollow pits of shadow. She turned to Evie, her face twisted with sorrow and rage. "Well, have you come?" the figure whispered, her voice a blend of despair and fury. Evie could barely speak. "Are you Lilith?" The figure's mouth curled into a bitter smile. "They burned me for their sins. They blamed me for their cruelty, and now they suffer as I did." Evie swallowed hard. "What do you want from us?" Lilith rose to her feet, her form towering and imposing. "Justice," she hissed. "Their bloodlines are tainted. The children are mine to reclaim. Their lives are the price for the lives they stole from me." "No!" Evie stepped forward, her fear replaced by anger. "Not all of us are guilty. Most of us weren't even alive then. You've punished innocence for centuries." Lilith's form flickered, her expression softening for a moment. "And yet, you all remain silent. You let my story fade, my name turn to a curse. Why should I show mercy when none was shown to me?" Evie's mind raced. She thought of the children who had disappeared, of her parents, of the endless nights haunted by that wail. "What if I could give you peace?" Lilith tilted her head, her gaze piercing. "Peace? You think such a thing is possible for me?" "Yes," Evie said, her voice steady. "Tell me what you need. Let me help you." Lilith extended a ghostly hand, and the forest seemed to hold its breath. "Then listen, child. There is a book hidden beneath the ruins of the old chapel. It holds the truth of what happened, the names of those who betrayed me. Bring it to the altar in the forest, and I will decide if your plea is worthy." The vision dissolved, and Evie was left alone in the clearing. The next day, she scoured the ruins of the chapel, digging through the rubble until her hands were raw. Finally, she found it. A leather-bound tome, its pages brittle with age. Inside were records of trials, confessions, and accusations. But what struck her most was a single entry. Wow. The children of Blackthorn were taken to the forest as offerings, their lives exchanged for prosperity. Lilith Graves was their scapegoat, silenced to hide the truth. Evie's stomach turned. The villagers' ancestors had been the real monsters, sacrificing their own to appease some dark force. Lilith had been innocent. That night, she returned to the altar, the book in hand. Lilith appeared once more, her form less menacing, her eyes softer. "You have done well," Lilith said, her voice tinged with sorrow. "The truth is revealed, but justice must still be served." Evie knelt before her. "What can I do?" Lilith extended her hand again. "Carry the truth to them. Make them remember. If they repent, I will rest. If they do not," her voice darkened, "the curse will remain." Evie returned to the village, the book clutched tightly to her chest. She gathered the townsfolk and read the damning truth aloud. Gasps and cries filled the square as the weight of their ancestors' sins came crashing down. Some begged for forgiveness, others wept openly, and a few stormed away, unwilling to face the truth. But the air shifted, the oppressive weight lifting ever so slightly. That night, the cry did not come. Lilith's shadow appeared one final time outside Evie's window. "You have done well, child. My pain is eased. But remember, The truth must never be buried again. And with that she faded, her sorrowful cry replaced by silence. The curse was broken, but Blackthorn would never forget. Story 7. The Dollmaker's Curse. Nestled in a secluded valley stood the village of Ebon Hollow, a place forgotten by time. Its cobblestone streets were lined with moss-covered cottages, and the villagers lived simple if wary lives. Yet, at the heart of the town, one building stood out, an old shop with a sign that read Dollmaker's Emporium. The windows were filled with porcelain dolls, their lifelike eyes seeming to follow passers-by. Few dared to enter, for the shop carried a dark legacy, the legend of the Dollmaker's Curse. Long ago, the shop belonged to a man named Elias Varnell, a master craftsman whose dolls were renowned far and wide. Each doll he created was a masterpiece, eerily lifelike, with eyes that sparkled as though holding the secrets of a soul. But Elias's success came at a cost. It was whispered that he had struck a bargain with dark forces, trading his own humanity for unparalleled skill. The villagers began to notice strange occurrences. Children who received Elias's dolls as gifts would fall ill, their vitality fading as the dolls seemed to grow more vibrant. Soon, children began to vanish altogether. When confronted, Elias denied any wrongdoing, but the villagers were unconvinced. One night, they stormed his shop, dragging him into the square. Before he was hanged, Elias uttered a chilling curse. "Thy creations are eternal. Their watchful eyes will never close, and their hunger will never end. Your children will pay for your sins, as will their children and their children's children." When Elias was dead, his shop burned to the ground, but the dolls survived, untouched by the flames. Over time, they were scattered throughout the village, passed down as heirlooms or hidden away. Generations later, the shop was rebuilt, its owner a mysterious woman named Margot Elms. No one knew where she had come from, but she claimed to be a doll maker, continuing Elias's trade. Her dolls bore an uncanny resemblance to his, their eyes gleaming with unsettling life. Despite their beauty, the villagers avoided her shop. It was Margot's death that reignited the curse. One stormy night, a group of children dared each other to sneak into the emporium. They found the dolls lined neatly on shelves, their faces frozen in expressions that seemed too real. In the center of the shop, on a workbench, was an unfinished doll. Its porcelain face was smooth and blank, its eyes hollow. The children fled, but they had disturbed something. The next morning, Margot was found dead in the shop, her body slumped over the workbench. In her hands, she clutched the unfinished doll. Years passed, and the emporium fell into disrepair. The villagers avoided it, but whispers grew of strange noises coming from within. Footsteps, whispers, and, most chilling of all, the soft laughter of children. When Lily Mayfair moved to Ebon Hollow with her young daughter Sophie, she was unaware of the shop's dark history. She bought the old emporium, charmed by its quaint exterior and spacious interior. She planned to turn it into a tea shop, unaware of the evil that lingered within. Sophie was fascinated by the abandoned dolls she found in the shop's attic. There were dozens of them, each unique, each unnervingly lifelike. Against Lily's better judgment, Sophie insisted on keeping one, a beautiful doll with auburn hair and emerald green eyes. She named it Clara. From the moment Clara entered their home, strange things began to happen. At first it was subtle. Sophie would speak to Clara as though the doll could respond, insisting that Clara was her friend. Lily dismissed it as a child's imagination. Then came the laughter, soft giggles echoing through the house when Sophie was asleep. Lily would find Clara in odd places, her head turned slightly, her eyes staring straight at her. One night, Lily awoke to find Sophie's bed empty. Panicked, she searched the house, her heart racing. She found her daughter in the attic, sitting in the dim light with Clara on her lap. "Sophie, what are you doing up here?" Lily demanded. "She told me to come," Sophie said, her voice distant. "Who told you?" "Clara," Sophie replied. "She says she wants to stay forever." Lily's blood ran cold. She grabbed the doll and threw it into a box, locking it in the basement. But that night, Sophie screamed. When Lily rushed to her room, she found Clara back on the bed, her emerald eyes glinting in the moonlight. Desperate, Lily turned to the village's elder, an old woman named Agnes, who remembered the legend of the doll-maker's curse. "You've brought one of his creations into your home," Agnes said gravely. "The dolls are bound by Elias's curse. They aren't just dolls. They're vessels." "Vessels for what?" Lily asked, trembling. "Spirits. Souls trapped by the curse, feeding off the living. If you don't destroy the doll, it will take Sophie." Agnes handed Lily an ancient book filled with rituals. The only way to break the curse was to destroy Clara in the Emporium, where the curse began. That night, Lily returned to the shop, Sophie in tow. The building groaned as they entered, the air thick with malice. Clara seemed heavier in Lily's arms, her emerald eyes glowing faintly. Lily placed the doll on the workbench and began the ritual, chanting the words from the book. The air grew colder, the shadows in the room shifting. Then the dolls began to move. One by one, they turned their heads, their lifeless eyes now alive with malevolence. They climbed down from their shelves, their porcelain feet clicking on the wooden floor. Lily continued the chant, her voice shaking. The dolls swarmed toward her, their tiny hands clawing at her legs. Sophie screamed, but Lily didn't stop. "Michael!" With a final, desperate cry, she smashed Clara against the floor. The doll shattered, releasing a deafening wail. The dolls froze, their eyes dimming as the curse was broken. The next morning, the Emporium stood empty, its windows shattered. Lily and Sophie left Ebon Hollow, vowing never to return. The villagers believe the curse is gone, but whispers remain. Sometimes, on stormy nights, they hear faint laughter coming from the ruins of the Emporium. And if you peer into the shadows, you might just see a pair of emerald green eyes watching, waiting. Story 8. The Haunting of Old Barlow House. Old Barlow House stood at the edge of Ravenswood, a decaying Victorian mansion with a reputation as dark as the shadows that clung to its cracked walls. The locals said the house was cursed, that no one who entered ever came out unchanged. For decades it sat abandoned, its windows like empty eyes, its silence heavy with secrets. But secrets have a way of luring the curious. Emily Hart was a journalist hungry for a story that would make her career. When she stumbled upon the legend of Old Barlow House, she saw an opportunity too good to ignore. The tales of the house were plentiful, whispers of ghostly figures in the windows, doors slamming in empty halls, and a chilling laughter that echoed in the dead of night. But what intrigued her most was the mystery of the Barlow family. In the late 1800s, the Barlows were one of the wealthiest families in Ravenswood. Arthur Barlow, a reclusive industrialist, had built the mansion for his wife Eleanor and their 2 children. But tragedy struck when Eleanor drowned in the backyard pond under mysterious circumstances. Not long after, the children vanished without a trace, and Arthur was found hanging from the chandelier in the grand foyer. The house was abandoned, and over the years, rumors of hauntings turned it into a forbidden place. Emily wasn't afraid of ghost stories. She packed her equipment, a camera, a flashlight, and a notebook, and headed to Old Barlow House determined to uncover the truth. The house loomed larger than Emily expected, its gabled roof reaching into the gray sky. Ivy clung to the stone walls like veins, and the iron gate screeched in protest as she pushed it open. The air was thick, the kind of silence that pressed against her ears and made her heartbeat feel unnaturally loud. She stepped inside, her flashlight cutting through the gloom. The grand foyer was covered in dust, the chandelier swaying slightly despite the absence of wind. The air smelled of mildew and something else. Something metallic. Like blood. Her first night passed uneventfully as she explored the house, documenting its eerie beauty. The dining room still held a long table with tarnished silverware set as if awaiting a meal. In the study, rows of books lined the shelves, their spines faded and cracked. She found a nursery on the second floor, toys strewn across the floor as though the children had just left. But it was the attic that unsettled her most. The walls were covered in strange symbols carved into the wood, and in the center of the room stood a circle of burned candles. Something about the room felt wrong, as though it were alive and watching her. That night, Emily set up camp in the library, her sleeping bag spread near the fireplace. She drifted off easily, but her sleep was disturbed by a faint sound. A child's giggle. Her eyes snapped open. The flashlight beside her flickered to life on its own, casting shadows that danced across the walls. She called out, her voice trembling. "Is someone there?" The giggle came again, closer this time. Emily grabbed her flashlight and followed the sound, her heart pounding. It led her to the nursery, where she found one of the dolls lying in the center of the room. She was certain it hadn't been there before. As she bent down to inspect it, the door slammed shut behind her. She screamed, fumbling with the doorknob, but it wouldn't budge. Then the whispers began. Soft, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to come from the walls themselves. The room grew colder, her breath visible in the air. "Leave," a voice rasped, low and menacing. When the door finally creaked open, Emily bolted back to the library, shaking. She tried to rationalize what had happened, blaming her exhaustion and an overactive imagination. But deep down, she knew she was no longer alone in the house. The next day, Emily found a hidden door in the study. Behind it was a staircase leading down to a dark, damp basement. The air was heavy, and the faint smell of decay grew stronger as she descended. Her flashlight revealed a room filled with old furniture and cobweb-covered crates. But in the center of the room, she found something chilling. A child's drawing etched into the dirt floor. It showed a tall man with hollow eyes standing over two small figures. Above them was a crude drawing of the house, and next to it, scrawled in shaky letters, was a single word: help. Suddenly, the temperature dropped, and her flashlight flickered. A low moan echoed through the basement, followed by the sound of footsteps. She turned, but the stairs were empty. Emily ran, the feeling of being chased growing stronger with every step. When she burst into the daylight, she collapsed onto the overgrown lawn, gasping for air. She wanted to leave, to never set foot in the house again, but something stopped her. The thought of the children. She couldn't abandon them, not if there was even a chance they were still here, trapped. That night, Emily returned to the attic. She studied the symbols, her flashlight illuminating the strange carvings. They looked ancient, but she recognized some from her research, symbols of summoning and binding. As she examined the room, the floorboards creaked, and a shadow moved in the corner of her eye. She turned, and there he was. A tall man with hollow eyes, his face twisted in a grotesque grin. He stepped forward, his movements unnaturally jerky, like a marionette. A summons for details. The last time, Michelle said. Emily backed away, her breath hitching. "What do you want?" she demanded, her voice shaking. The man raised a hand, and the whispers filled the room again. From the shadows, two small figures emerged. Children, their faces pale and their eyes wide with fear. "Free us," one of them pleaded, their voice barely a whisper. Emily realized the truth. The children hadn't vanished. They'd been taken, their souls bound to the house by their father's madness. Arthur Barlow hadn't been a grieving widower. He had dabbled in dark magic, sacrificing his own family to gain power. Determined to end the curse, Emily returned to the basement, carrying a can of gasoline and a lighter. She poured the fuel across the dirt floor, soaking the furniture and walls. As she struck the match, the whispers grew louder, turning into screams. The fire roared to life, consuming the room. The shadowy figure appeared, his hollow eyes blazing with fury, but he couldn't stop her. The flames spread, climbing the walls and devouring the house. Emily ran as the mansion burned, the screams of the trapped spirits echoing behind her. When she reached the edge of the property, she turned back to see the house collapse in on itself, the fire swallowing it whole. In the days that followed, the townspeople noticed a strange peace in Ravenswood. The oppressive feeling that had hung over the village for decades was gone, and though Emily's story was met with skepticism, she knew the truth. The spirits of old Barlow House were finally free. But sometimes, late at night, she could still hear a child's giggle and wonder if the curse was truly broken.